All right, everybody, good day as we gather here in January 2022. This is our monthly episode of Calmly Considered at Faith Seeking Understanding University. I'm Allan Bevere, and I am the self-appointed Anselm of Canterbury Chair of Podcast Theology and Cultured Faith Seeking Understanding University, where all seekers are welcome to ponder profound things free of charge. And as always, my conversation partner is Michael Kruse of Kansas City fame, and who is the Grand Poobah Chair of Economics and Public Theology here at FSUU. Michael, I think we need a mascot here.
We do need something. Well,
so why not the water buffalo?
Well, we could go with this guy.
We could go with the Yoda too. Yeah,
we could go with the Yoda here.
And of course, we don't have a sports team, and of course, we don't even have any classrooms or buildings, or we don't have anything. We're just making this up. It might be kind of fun. Maybe I'll have some hats made up or something.
We might have to work with that. Yeah.
So I always like to ask you how things are in Kansas City, but I'm guessing with the postseason in the NFL, you're doing all right.
Yeah, I think there was a game this weekend of some kind.
There was a game. And I know you watched it.
Yeah.
And I got to tell you, the first quarter, I was going, man,
what's going?
When is the Chiefs offense going to show up?
Yep. Well, I was tweeting back and forth with a Steelers friend of mine, and I was just saying, I'm not worried. I said, Andy's over there with his hands on the offensive dials. He's just getting it dialed in just right. Just give it a few minutes. So then, boom, there it goes.
Yeah. Yep. In the first quarter, to tweaks things. Second quarter starts, you're good. They actually did. They did after that. They played really well.
So.
All right. Well, so today's topic is abundance versus scarcity. Do we live in a world of abundance? Do we live in a world of scarcity? Probably depends who you talk to.
Mm-hmm.
And it probably depends what perspective they're coming from, whether this is a world of abundance or scarcity. So we're going to kind of work through that today from perspectives of economics and from a Christian perspective as well, and see what we can figure out. So Michael, I'm going to start it off by asking you to give us just a summary of. Okay, well, let me start out this way. So one of the things that you have said is that from an economic standpoint, we live in a world of scarcity.
Right.
From a spiritual standpoint, at least if you listen to preachers and you do a lot of theological reading, we live in a world of abundance.
Right.
Who's right? Well, let's not answer that yet. Let's define that. Why do economists say we live in a world of scarcity, but the theologians focus on a world of abundance? What's going on there?
Well, I see two things happening, and I think it's nuances in terms of how you understand the word scarcity. What does it mean? What is it? How does it fit? Economists, I think, are looking at scarcity from a very empirical point of view. There is a level of demand for things. There is amount of resources with which to produce things. The demand far exceeds the amount of resources. So therefore, there is scarcity relative to what it is that people want. So people have to find some way to make decisions about what they're going to do or not do, which things are going to get priority. Individually and corporately, you've got to figure out how to do that. So, but with the economist being supposedly trying to be objective and impartial does not place a moral judgment on the things that people are saying they want. So the demand may be there, and people may be wanting things that aren't good for them or aren't productive for society. The economist isn't going to weigh that. They're just going to look at what's there. So you don't have a sense of what's supposed to be normative in terms of people's wants and desires. I think on the other side is scarcity can also be looked at as a spiritual state, an emotional state in which someone exists, in which they always feel like, despite what's objectively there, they always feel like there isn't enough or there isn't going to be enough. And so then you begin to orient your life around always making sure that you have enough and that you can get that. And the the tension that I sense in a lot of discussions between people who are economists and people who are theologians, and they're trying to talk abundance and scarcity, is theologians hear economists promoting the idea that we should think emotionally from a standpoint of scarcity. And that's not what I understand at all economists be saying. And the economists that I talk to are just aghast that, like, where did you come up with that? You know, that's what we're teaching. In fact, economists, I think, would say that by creating an efficient economy that allows production of abundance, that their science is actually about abundance, because it talks about how most efficiently do we, use the resources we have in order to create the stuff that we want. Meanwhile, theologians correctly understand that we live in a world of sin, and people have simple motivations, and they have simple desires. There's avarice, there's greed, there's all these things that feed into the system. So a lot of the stuff that gets fed into the economic system in terms of production that those economists are promoting is bad stuff. And that gets counted as part of this equation that the economists are using. So I think that that's the kind of tension that exists. Is it an empirical measurement? Yes, there is an amount of resources, there's an amount of demand. So that's an empirical question. And sometimes, let me add one other piece to this. My point would be, I think economists would say that if you had every human being operating with totally appropriate moral values, if we as Christians talk about people who are fully Christian formed, there would still be X number of hours in the day and only X number of resources available, and you still would not be able to produce everything that you want to produce, even with good intentions and good values. So therefore, you still have to come somehow to make those decisions. And so I think they would say that simply changing our moral frame doesn't solve the economic problem in terms of where does abundance come from.
Right. So what you're saying is that even if everybody in the world was good-hearted and altruistic and wanted to make sure that everybody had enough food to eat and clothes to wear and shelter, that there's still scarcity in reference to you only have so much time to make all that happen, right?
Well, yeah. And so if you think from the standpoint, everything that you have around you, you look in your office there, you look at home, wherever you are, you look around, every single thing around you that you use does not exist in its natural form in nature.
Right.
It had to be extracted or grown or somehow taken from nature and transformed from a less useful form into a more useful form, and then brought into your presence to be able to use it. So the idea that there's just an abundance that naturally exists in terms of things existing as human beings use them, it doesn't exist. So
Right.
somehow we have to figure out, how does it get from that form into this form that people use? And that's what the economists, I think, are asking.
Right.
And so, yeah, so that's the question.
So then, it's not wrong. Is it wrong? It's not wrong for me to say in the pulpit on Sunday morning, our God is a God of abundance.
Yes.
Our God has given generously. Our God has given us a world of abundance, but in its raw form.
Right.
If you don't do something with it, things are going to be scarce. Is that correct?
Exactly. Right. Yeah. So
right. So just because you got plenty of wood to build the houses, if nobody builds the houses, all that wood standing there, all those trees standing there, what does it do? You're not going to be sheltered. Right. So that's the point.
Yeah. And so I think abundance is something that occurs out of human beings acting in partnership with God, living out God's sense of what it means to be the community. That's where abundance comes from. But that is people actively participating in the process of creating abundance. It isn't that God just zaps it into existence and now we distribute it. I think that's the sometimes it feels like the underlying thing that the theologian is saying when they're criticizing economists. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, so that's one other thing I want to push back just a little bit.
Uh-huh.
And I haven't read everybody on this, every theologian, so I want to be careful here. But usually what I read when I'm reading the theologians on this issue, or when I'm thinking about this issue myself, is I don't think there's it may be a misinterpretation of economists, and so
Right.
I was reading some of your quotes, when economists say we live in a world of scarcity, and then the theologian goes after that, they miss the point. They missed the point. And so I concede that. That's true. But I think for a lot of us, it isn't so much that we we're saying we live in abundance naturally, a world of abundance
Right.
naturally, we are raising questions about how we produce and live together, and we are raising questions about motives, and
Right.
we are, we can go to the Bible and find a lot of evidence, obviously, for the prophets and others condemning greed,
Right.
condemning unjust gain at the expense of others. So I think, it just seems to me in my reading that, in my think about this, that's where most of us land. It's we, maybe we haven't thought about the economic issues of scarcity to really understand what economists are saying, and I think that's a fair point.
Yeah.
But I don't see anybody saying this is naturally an abundant world that we can just use just by being here.
Right.
So I kind of, when I read some of that, I chafed a little bit, thinking, oh, wait a minute. No. The problem is exactly what you just stated, that theologians are going after. It's the problem of motivations, greed and selfishness and self-centeredness. That's what it is we're pushing at.
Right.
Is that fair?
I think I think there is some truth in that. I think there are problems from both sides of this discussion.
Yeah.
I think is part of the issue. I think economists immediately tune out when they hear a theologian saying that all their discipline doing is promoting that people have a sense of scarcity in their lives, and that they live their lives motivated by that. I think most economists, as soon as they hear that, they tune out, because that is not what economists understand their discipline to be about, or what they're promoting. So it feels very, I don't know, pejorative, straw man,
Gotcha.
kind of.
No, and I think that's fair.
Yeah.
So let me then raise, and I mentioned this to you briefly before we went on, and that is, as a pastor over the years, I talk about the abundance of God's grace. I got all kinds of scripture for all of this. I can go to scripture and say abundance and what's God given. And everybody says, yes, we got abundance. And then we get in finance committee meeting and it's nothing about scarcity.
Yeah.
Right. And even, by the way, I will tell you, because I've had this experience, it's about scarcity even when you've got a church sitting on a couple $1 million of endowment.
Yeah.
What's the difference? What's going on with that?
Well, that's a good question. I'll let you tell me. I've been in those same session meetings as a Presbyterian, with pastors. We talk, let's all trust in God's abundance. Well, where are we going to get the $10,000 to fix the boiler next week?
Because I'm not, I'm not sure. Well, and you talk about,
right.
I think maybe, again, there's some talking past each other.
Yeah.
Because I think when people think about scarcity, they don't think what the economists are thinking.
Right.
But what you're saying about what the economists are saying makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
The lamb isn't going to slaughter itself and cook itself for you, right?
Right. Right.
So if you don't do anything, you've got scarcity. You're going to go hungry.
Yeah.
But I think I do think there is a sense of, well, okay. So let me back up. Let me talk a little bit about my experience. And I don't know where you've traveled, Michael, but I've been in some pretty poor places in the world.
I have as well.
And what I think of my friends in Cuba, and I go to Cuba. Well, not since COVID. Hopefully one day I'm gonna get back there. But I go down there to teach pastors in Havana at the Methodist Seminary there. And these folks are poor, and there isn't anybody, there's not anybody in America, even those who we would consider in poverty, who are as poor as they are. They're poor.
Sure. Oh, yeah.
Yet I continue to be astounded by what the church does in ministry for not only the church folks, but for the community with so little.
Exactly.
And we get in the finance committee meeting with $2 million of endowments sitting on, and we talk about, these bills and that bills. Can we really do that? I think it's a mindset. I think it's an attitude, because when I look at the Christians in Cuba, and I want to be careful here, I know in some sense we're comparing apples to oranges, being in the United States with our economy and being in Cuba with their economy. I understand that. Mm-hmm. But they've got a perspective on money and wealth that is different. And again, I want to be careful because I don't want to say that Americans aren't generous. And in fact, one thing we know is that when there's some kind of disaster somewhere in the world, Americans are very generous in giving,
Right.
to tsunamis and hurricanes and relief and all kinds of things, right?
Sure. Right.
But they've got this perspective that it's almost as well. It's as as things that I hear, I like to say, and others like to say, we're blessed to be a blessing.
Okay. Yeah.
They really embody that.
Yeah.
They really, I mean, they give sacrificially because that's the only way they can give.
Right.
They're
Right.
the widow. They're the widow putting in the 2 pennies. They
Right.
give sacrificially because that's all they can give. We're like
Right.
the wealthy putting the leftovers into the treasury.
Yeah.
And I think, I think that helps explain some of this.
Yeah. And I'll just add a footnote to that too. There were times in the past where I was a treasurer for a congregation, and I was also treasurer for our presbytery for a time. And I saw, the gifts that come in, and I know this from other empirical work that's been done on this too, that it's often the people who have the least resources are the ones who are the most faithful givers to the church and to the causes. As the wealth income goes up, you seem to see a less strong pattern of people giving, from as a proportion of what they give. So as you get wealthier, I can think of multiple examples, but I've been to Native American reservations in the Southwest. I've been to Kingston, Jamaica. I think one of the most vivid memories I have is seeing people that were living off the trash dumps in Kingston. There is grinding poverty that exists for hundreds of millions of people, around the world. And I think when many Americans go experience those people that are living in those cultures and those situations, it brings into sharp focus how we live our own lives. And we begin to question what it is that we're striving for. For many of us, it does that. What are we striving for? What are our values? And I think the motive often becomes, well, I need to live a less consumer-oriented lifestyle. I need to not be so consumed by trying to keep up with the Joneses and all that type of stuff. And so I want to live my life more simply. That is, I think, a good pietistic lesson to learn from that situation, that we need to be personally, spiritually formed to be different. But my point would be, in addition to that, that does absolutely nothing for the person that's living there on that trash dump or living on that reservation. The issue for them is they have been excluded from the networks of productivity and exchange that would allow them to live a more beyond subsistence living, to live a more abundant life, because they've been excluded from that. And so then the question then becomes, how do we invest in people that are in those circumstances, right, so that their life is a cycle of increasing abundance within their own community? So there is the pietistic question of, I shouldn't say pietistic, the personal spiritual formation question of, are my values and my sense of the world, is it skewed in a bad direction? And so I need to be formed. And then that, hopefully, if you have other people around you, you begin to develop that, you snowball an attitude that changes how our culture operates. And maybe we come up with better decisions about how we do things in our economy. So maybe that develops. But the broader issue of how do you address poverty in the world, that doesn't solve the problem of poverty. So the issue is, how do you create that abundance? And I agree with you. I want to come back to the point that you're making about, you see this in so many of poor communities around the world. You hear this testified to over and over again from all sorts of the sense of being generous and being connected with each other and supporting each other, I think is I think that's there. I think I mentioned in an earlier video that one of the interesting questions or interesting observations I read sometime back recently, it says, it's curious that in like pre-industrial cultures or in very poor cultures like this, where there is very little in terms of production and very little in terms of trade and this type of stuff, that people are are generous and share with each other. They're actually not that interdependent, because almost everything that they work on, they work for their personal consumption.
Right.
As we go through a capitalist system, almost nothing we do is for our personal consumption. We do it in order to get income to trade with others in order to do it. And yet we see ourselves more isolated and individualistic and self-supporting than the person who's living in poverty in those situations. It's an upside down, way of looking at things. And so
and it's set, and it again, it's another testimony for me, or a confirmation or an affirmation of what I think the scripture says, and that is that I was just having a conversation this morning. Every Tuesday morning at 8:30, I meet with other pastors in our town, some of the pastors who follow the lectionary, and we talk about the lectionary text for Sunday for our sermons. It's a wonderful time. Look forward to it.
Yeah, I'll bet.
And so this week's text is Paul talking about the body of Christ in 1 Corinthians, members of the body. And the one thing that I was making the point was that this is hard really for us to understand. Paul's got a very participationist Christology. Right. That means we participate now in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, right? I mean, we do, and that's why we are the body of Christ. This is a very robust understanding of the church. And it's very hard for us in the West to understand this, because we think first and foremost of ourselves as individuals.
Right.
So I'm an individual, I'm Allan Bevere, and you are Michael Kruse, and you have your individuality, and I have my individuality. And then I fit myself into the community, in this case, the church, but I determine how I fit. And so it's my individualism that is primarily my identity, right?
Correct. Yeah.
Whereas for Paul, it's the other way around.
Right.
You're in Christ. You're part of this community. Yes, you're an individual. Paul wouldn't deny that.
Sure.
That's why the body has many parts. But he says, again, if you're an ear, you don't get to decide you want to be an eye.
Right. Yeah. Right. Yeah.
You don't get to say, I'm an individual. I get to determine. I have self-determination. Right. This is not what Paul says. So it's hard for. So what I'm getting at here with that long drawn out image is the problem that the more I get, the more tempted I am to be self-focused. I've got more to protect. I've got more to hang on to. Whereas if I have very little, right, I can appreciate the fact that my neighbor also has very little.
Right.
I mean, is there something that becomes, so when you said this, this just Michael, you need to write a series of blog posts, right? Okay. I got to do this, Michael. This is your assignment. This is your. Okay. We'll peer review it, since that's what we do around here. But you said in capitalism, most of what we do is not for ourselves.
Right.
Right. And when you think about that, that is true.
Yeah.
Most of what we do is for other people, and yet. Think of how we think capitalism is so individually focused. And if you want to start talking about doing stuff for the community or doing stuff for the larger community, now you're a socialist.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
Boy, that's just an interesting thought.
Yeah.
I mean, wow. I mean, all of a sudden there's people who are listening to this who have bought into the stereotypes. Their heads are exploding.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah.
I mean,
yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
But no, it's a much more complicated question in terms of how does our spirituality fit with this. But I think the question you're raising, I think sort of gets to the penultimate question, but I don't think it quite gets to the ultimate question. So you were saying, so as we get more, does our life become more focused on ourselves because we have more to protect? I think one of the single best analogies, it's a fairly simple one. It's not all that dramatic, but it's one that I found very interesting. It's Richard Foster. He wrote a book about simplicity, 20, 30 years ago. And in it, he gives this analogy where he says, if I drop a piece of string, a length of thread on a table in front of you and ask you to put it into a straight line, he says, one of the things you might do is you might take that thread and you keep working it around, trying to get it to go into a straight line. You'll never get it entirely straight. if you keep poking and pushing at the various places on it. He says, however, if you put your finger on one end of that thread and begin to draw it across the table, the whole thing will come into a perfectly straight line. And so his point is where is your focus? What is the one thing that you're focused on? We spend a lot of our time trying to focus on pushing at various edges of that string. Am I living too consumerist, or am I not living, am I living too aesthetically? Am I doing this? Am I doing? And so then the focus, if your focus becomes then about God and serving God and God's kingdom, and you begin to devote your life to understanding who God is, what it is that God desires, what God's kingdom is about, the other pieces then begin to fall in line behind that service and commitment to service to God and living out the kingdom. And so I think as you mentioned, the individualistic notion in the church in the United States, it appears to me, is that a lot of us come into church as an adjunct, as an accessory to help us live a more fulfilled life, when we have already got our finger put it on the string and pulling it in a direction other than God's going. And so we're looking to the church to try to help reinforce and help build us in our direction that we're going, rather than surrendering ourselves to understanding who God is and what the kingdom is about and how do we follow it. And so I think that's the reason the church often never gets anywhere. It's because we got all these people with these different, we're not pulling in the same direction.
I've told people before that I as a pastor, I'm not the only pastor who despises, but you get a visitor comes in and on a Sunday, and you welcome them and greet them and everything. And they'll say things like, well, I've moved to the community and I'm just church shopping. And I just have always hated that, shopping, right? Because it's like, if you don't like the price of the gas at BP, go across the street to Marathon, right? I just, because it's so consumeristic, and I don't like it. And I used to say, I used to tell people in the church that the first time someone comes in and says, well, I'm here I'm seeking where God is calling me to be, I'm going to fall over. They're going to have to come and wheel me out. Boy, lo and behold, I don't know. It'd been a month after I said that. I had a visitor in church on Sunday morning, and afterwards I welcomed her and talked to her. And we had conversation. She says, I'm here. I'm new to the community, and I just am trying to discern where God is calling me to serve. And I thought, do I hear angels singing? Because again, I think that highlights part of the problem that we're talking about. I want to turn the conversation a little bit, because, and you mentioned it right at the beginning, I want to have some time to talk about this, because because the issue of motive, why we do what we do.
Right.
One of the things that gives me heartburn as a Christian is and maybe I'm being a little bit too harsh here, but the state of moral discourse in the church, I think, is just almost embarrassing. It's a disaster. And let's talk. I want to mention COVID in relationship to this. The first question for Christians, it seems to me, and you talked about, theologians are interested in character, right? Yes, we are. We think character is important. Okay.
Yeah.
So I always said the first question should be in Christian ethics is not, what are my rights?
Right.
What are my obligations?
Yes, exactly.
Because throughout the Bible, as I've said it, and I'll continue to say it, throughout the Bible, we are told to love God and love neighbor.
Right.
Nowhere does anybody say, I've got my rights. Now, the rights conversation can be complicated, but so the first question for me has always been, and it's been like this in the time of COVID. How do I love my neighbor in this time? What are the things that I should do to love my neighbor? When you've got a lot of Christians more concerned about what are my rights?
Right.
And I don't think as a church, if we're focused first and foremost on what our rights are, by the way, if I'm concerned about anyone's rights, it ought to be somebody else's, right? It shouldn't be mine. It should be yours. I should be concerned about yours.
Right.
But you can't command that. So people talk about mask mandates and vaccine mandates, and you go the law. That's another issue in the courts. But I want to say, as Christians, if you're focused on that singularly and primarily, you're missing the point. You're missing the point of what God, the obligations that God has placed on you to love your neighbor.
Right.
And so when we talk about scarcity, abundance, and all of this, I mean, ultimately, I think you and I talked a little bit about this when we did our capitalism, socialism discussion. Ultimately, nothing works unless human beings have the right motives.
Yeah, exactly. Yes. There is no system that fixes that people don't have the right motives.
System.
Yeah.
So, we can talk about taxing billionaires, and I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but I'm saying ultimately, the billionaires have to be motivated, right? Just like you and I do. I'm not putting them in a separate category. I'm simply saying there's got to be a motivation that there's a Christian motivation.
Right.
And no amount of law or coercion, and again, we need law. I'm not opposed to any of that, but no amount of that's going to change it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. How do we see ourselves as part of a beloved community rather than simply as individuals? And I think that is extremely, probably in the United States, that's probably more so than most nations. That is a very difficult thing because our culture is so oriented towards the individualism. Yeah. I was just going to add one of the things that I see in the middle of this is we're talking about basically Christian formation. How does person become formed as a Christian? And right now, the current things that form most of us in terms of our Christian formation is Fox News, MSNBC, our Facebook feed, not people getting together, looking at the word, and then reflecting together about what that means. And a pastor giving a sermon with 15 or 20 minutes, or maybe if you're a Baptist, 30 minutes of preaching, that one little input versus the hours and hours of input that come in terms of people's spiritual formation. And I just, to me, it feels like the church, by the church, I mean evangelicals, I mean mainstream, I mean mainline, I mean other denominations, so on. It seems to me that we are lost in terms of trying to form Christians. How does that happen? And just the coaching and the nurturing of each other from people who are more mature Christians to those that are coming up in the faith. It just, that almost feels rare. You're talking about your woman who came in and says, I'm just looking for a place to serve. I mean, that just feels like a drop of water in the middle of the desert. Sometimes.
Absolutely.
And seeing that healthy formation of Christians, to me, often feels the same way.
And by the way, I think I need to say real quickly, I'm not saying to those who say I'm church shopping, I'm not trying to nefarious motives to them. This is the culture we've all grown up in.
Sure.
Right.
Yeah.
This is the context we've grown up in. So I'm not assigning nefarious motives. I'm simply saying that this problem is endemic to us. It's to banter a word around another discussions. It's systemic.
Right.
And so I tend to think, I'm retiring. So here in a few short months, and so we're going to be attending a church, it'll be a Methodist church because I'm a Methodist, but I've got several options. Now I have to ask myself, am I going to attend where I really get the most of what I want, whatever that might be in a church, or am I really going to seriously seek the Lord and say, I need discernment from you on where you are calling me to serve.
Right. Yeah.
Which may be in a completely unexpected congregation.
Right. Yeah.
In other words, my first choice might not be God's first choice.
Exactly right. Yeah. But I think back to a book, I can't remember the name of it, Ivan Illich, I think was the name of the author, probably 35 years ago or so. And he had this wonderful point, which has stuck with me through the years. He's talking about the language of need. He says we often use the word need in some very frivolous kind of situations. Walk into McDonald's, I need a Big Mac, fries. You don't need a Big Mac or fries or anything. You want a Big Mac,
Yes.
or fries. And so he talks about banishing the word for need from your vocabulary, unless you have thought through intentionally, what it is that you need that thing for.
Yeah.
What are we doing? And so one of the things that's happened over the years is I often find myself, when I say I need something or I want something, I think a level of spiritual formation comes in as soon as I hear that word, is to stop myself and say, I need that for what? I want that for what? What is that going to happen? So therefore, when I say, well, I need a church that does this, that, and why do I need a church that does this, that, or the other thing? That's one of the things, and I was going to point that out because you're talking about the idea of looking for a community, but I think the same thing fits into the economic questions we ask in all aspects of life. We either get money from employment, from gifts, we spend money, or we save money. We invest it. So all three of those are in conflict with each other to one degree or another. You have to have some balance of them. And how are you going to make decisions about those from an economic standpoint?
Yeah.
And so then that has to be led again by this pulling the string analogy. What is your commitment to God? That's going to help shape how you influence those three aspects of your economic decisions. Yeah.
It's very, I tell my wife in retirement, I need a canoe to go fishing. So, of course I don't need one. I want one, but by the way, this is something I've thought about for years, is the fact that in a society like ours, which is a society of abundance, right, in the economic sense, production sense, it becomes harder to distinguish want from need, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely does. And I think another complex question, some reading I was doing recently, which I think is exactly spot on. So we were talking about poor people that exist today. You look back at the Israelites, back in the early Israelites, agrarian community, not much production. But what did abundance mean in that limited context where they had no knowledge of how to produce things and how to trade at the level that we do today, and so on and so forth? The idea was that at least everybody had, the goal was, at least everybody is supposed to participate in some minimal level of sharing of a common existence within the community, to have a certain level of that. And so one of the previous conversations we had is that we are eliminating absolute poverty around the world. That's good news that's happening, that we're seeing the people are now living above subsistence level. But in a world where we have the technological knowledge to know how to radically increase production and to use trade to do these kind of things, does that not then elevate what the minimal level of participation is for all citizens of the world, right, in terms of how they participate in the economy and the American economy? So that what becomes abundant changes with the degree of knowledge and technical sophistication that humanity has in terms of what abundance means. So on the one hand, we can look objectively at people in the past and say, oh, poor people are so much better off objectively than they were 300 years ago. And that's true. But there is still the relational aspect of what occurs in the present. And are they participating at a level in functioning society that people in the past did in their more limited circumstances? I think that's the issue.
Yeah, the participation, I think, is really, I know a ministry here in Ohio where it was started by a pastor years ago, and boy, I admire him. He moved his family into a rough neighborhood in order to start a church in this rough neighborhood. And not only did he start it, but he has a congregation of, they probably have 100, 150 people on a Sunday morning. They have a congregation of drug addicts and people in recovery and people who've been paroled from prison. All the parolees from local prison and jail go to that church.
Oh, that's funny.
And they actually worked, they actually opened up a little restaurant to give people experience and give them wages and stuff.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's just this shining example of allowing people to participate, as you say, in the system, so that not only can they be better, but then they can also then help others.
They're contributing.
And
Yeah.
it's just astounding thing. But I don't think, again, I think we think about giving in the church as more like charity. I always said the difference between charity and mission is charity is something I give you and it makes me feel good. It helps you, you know, I give you a meal, you feel good, I feel good for a little bit. And that's good, nothing wrong with that.
Right.
But that's not enough. You know, what do I do to help you? What do we do to help you participate in
Right.
this producing of abundance?
Right. Yeah.
Right.
Right.
That's what you're saying.
Yeah. And I think it's Brian Fickert. I can't remember the name of the book that he wrote sometime back that I thought was particularly helpful. And it's his language, but it's the same thing I learned studying economic development 30 years ago at Eastern, and you know, other conversations I've had. He talks about sort of three levels in terms of how we address people that are in poverty. So the first one is the sort of the rescue phase, which is there is a famine, there's been an earthquake, there's been something dramatic that's happened, and you have to get the population stabilized. That's got to be the first thing. Then once things are stabilized, there's the rehabilitation phase. How do we build back the pieces that then allow things to function, to allow people to interact, to have some safety, and to have some consistency? And then comes the redevelopment phase, which is the idea of how do you energize the pieces to work together better to create that cycle of upward movement where you have greater productivity and exchange. And for most of us, we're at the rescue phase.
Yeah.
And that's the part that feels so good, because somebody's desperately need, and we give some money, and that helps them get out of that immediate situation. We feel good, and it is good. Those are good things that need to contribute. But when you start getting to the rehabilitation, redevelopment phase, that becomes much more complicated. It becomes much more blurry. It's more diffuse. It's hard to measure exactly how much you've contributed, and yet it's exactly the place where people are most going to benefit in terms of them and their families and their future generations. And that's the part we don't invest in. Yeah,
I remember visiting New Orleans to do some work, mission work, gutting houses after Katrina, three or 4 years after Katrina.
Yeah.
And communities that had not ever come back, and still probably today are not come back because, by the way, we do this with funerals, don't we? Somebody dies, and what happens? We surround the person, we surround the loved one who's lost the person. They have more casserole dishes than they can fit in their refrigerator. We call them, we surround them with prayer, we minister to them in all kinds of ways, and it's wonderful. It's a great thing. But then after the funeral is over and time goes on, and they're still grieving and mourning, the activity tends to stop.
Yep.
We tend to move on. So I don't know how to, we have to be, that just tells me we have to be intentional. I want to say one other thing just real quick here. I don't want to say that all Christians who have wealth are stingy people, which of course we know is not true. I have had persons in every congregation I have served who have been people of financial means who have been very generous. And I know their generosity because I'm the pastor, and nobody else knows, and it's confidential, and they want it that way. They don't want the left hand to know what the right hand is doing, but they're very generous, and so we want to be careful here. But the Bible, the Bible's counsel is helpful when it says the love of money is the root of all evil.
Yes.
The problem is not money, but the love of money.
Exactly.
It can, if we're not careful, it can, like many other things, work its way into our heart. One of John Wesley's quotes, and there's all kinds of John Wesley quotes on the internet that are not said by John Wesley. But one of the quotes that one of the things he said that is absolutely true is he says, whenever I get money, I get rid of it as quickly as I can, lest it work its way into my heart.
Right. Yeah, there you go.
Right. Yeah. And so, so the counsel is there, but yes, there are people who are wealthy in the church and who are great benefactors. And they do assist the church in its ministries by their giving. So I need to say that.
Yeah, and I just add a piece there. It sparked something that I think is important to recognize as well too, and that is that if we talk about past, going a few generations past, or we look at people that are in poverty today, we look at those situations and we talk about their level of existence. All right, are we to say that was an ideal existence, that we all should rather go live like people lived in ancient Israel than today with vaccines, with iPads and telephones, and all the many things that I don't think anybody's saying that.
Yeah.
But the only way that we got to where we are today is that we radically increased wealth, we radically increased production to have those things. So it has benefited us. And I think that to me is the theological one at the center of the theological economic discussion that needs to happen productively between theologians and economists, is how do you reconcile the fact that we do improve lives through trade and through production and increasing wealth for everybody, but that very increase in wealth and production for everybody is what leads us into this idolatry of need, feeling like we need certain things that we don't need. How do we reconcile that?
Yeah.
And I'm asking that more, just sort of as an open-ended thing, that's a life question,
Yeah, and I, again, I don't think there are any hard and fast rules. It's, yeah. It's a good question. One other issue I want to hit, because this relates.
Okay.
Is because of late, we've had within the past few months, certain billionaires who've gone up into space and spent their own money, and of course, you get then people saying, we ought to be taxing that money, and I mean, when you think about, when you do, I mean, I have to tell you, the first time years ago when I finally understood the difference between $1 million and $1 billion, I didn't realize that like $1 billion was like a lot more than $1 million. I mean, holy cow. It's a lot of money. And, I mean, I don't want to get into the issue of taxing people now. That's not our point. Maybe another show, another time we could talk about taxes and how we think that works. But the fact of the matter is that as a Christian, is there a time, and I mean, let's just say I become a billionaire,
Right.
Is there a time that as a Christian, there's just too much?
Yeah, right.
Even if I've worked for it. Look, even if I worked for it, is a Christian, should I at some point say, really?
Right.
Do I really need, I mean, and I know there are, I know Bill Gates has given away millions and millions and billions.
Right.
He's working, and I applaud all of that.
Right.
I'm struggling with the idea that if I tomorrow found myself a billionaire as a Christian, I don't know that I could remain that.
Right. Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I don't know. I hear exactly what you're saying, and you don't have to get up to billionaire for me to begin to start.
Well, exactly right. Exactly. I just use billionaire because that's what everybody's been talking about.
That's the most extreme, but I struggle with the same question. I think some of the things that I think about with regard to that, at least in a capitalist society where you have the idea of private ownership of production, means of production, that if you build a company and you're still the central figure in that company, most of the wealth that you have, even if it's in the billions, most of that is not dollars sitting in a bank.
Right.
Most of it is capital invested in a going enterprise that's producing products and so on and so forth. And you're managing that set of resources that is engaged in economy. Yeah. So if people talk about these billionaires hoarding their billions, well, they're not hoarding. They're not sitting off in a barn away from everybody where nobody gets use of them. They're being actively employed. So that is one filter that I think about with some of that. Then Jeff Bezos, I think it was, I think I remember seeing some article recently where he says, I'll give, I can't remember what it was, how many billions. He says, I'll give billions of dollars away. He says, I'll write the check, in order to end world poverty, he says, if you can tell me that if you can show me how when I write that check that 5 years later that those same people won't still be hungry and in poverty.
Exactly
And
right.
so he's highlighting the point that me just giving my money away doesn't solve the problem. It's more complicated than that. And so I think those are 2 points counter to the idea that it's totally wrong to have billionaires. But on the other hand, the lifestyles that are lived, the money that's used, that's an interesting moral question. Economists, they'll come in, and I shouldn't say many will come in and say, well, that's not for us to decide as economists. We're supposed to evaluate people's moral decisions. They just do, what they're going to do, and we work the economy. But as a theologian, you don't have that luxury. Theologian, you do have to weigh.
I'm not talking about taxing people and coercion. I'm saying I'm applying that question to myself. That if tomorrow I found myself sitting on money that I would never be able to spend in a lifetime, living, just a middle-class lifestyle,
sure.
Could I just hang on to it? So it's actually that moral question. It's not, and that's what, again, it's that question when I say, when we Christians ask first, what are my rights as opposed to my obligations?
Right.
The first question isn't, should you tax me? Should I get taxed? The first question for me is, what do I do with this?
Yes.
As a Christian, how am I obligated? And that's where I think sometimes we fall down.
Right.
So I just wanted to, because to me, for a Christian, just like everything, wealth is not an amoral thing.
Right. Right.
I mean, and as I've said to folks, I said, I get 100% of my income after taxes, and I tithe that. Well, I've got 90% left. That doesn't mean the 90% of mine is to do as I please. No, that also belongs to God.
Right.
And yes, I have to spend some of it on us because we need to eat and we need to live in the house, blah, blah, blah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. But it isn't mine just to do with what I want. For Christians, we believe that, no, it's all God's, and I'm responsible for using it as a good steward.
Yeah. I think Tony Campolo always used to have this thing where he says, you tithe, you give 10% to God's kingdom. He says, that's great. What are you going to do with the other 90% of God's money?
Exactly right. Yeah. So boy, there's a lot there. There's a lot there to talk about, even more to talk about. But so I think the question always is, what do we, again, what are my obligations as a follower of Jesus? How am I obligated to use my wealth as I am obligated to use my gifts and my talents and everything else that I happen.
Yeah.
So so as someone who knows the ins and outs of economists, if you could say one thing to theologians and pastors from that perspective, when we talk about abundance and scarcity, what piece of wisdom would you offer?
Yeah. I think the thing that frustrates a lot of economists when I talk to them, and let me preface this by saying some of it, the grief that economists get is earned.
Some of the what?
Some of the grief that economists get,
some of the grief they get is
earned.
Well, that happens with pastors too.
Exactly. Right. But I think particularly people that I have known that are economists, that are Christians, that I consider to be well-formed in their faith, and they're trying to be faithful in their profession. I think the thing that they would encourage theologians to do is to listen carefully to what it is they're saying, and not these knee-jerk emotional responses to what does scarcity mean, and what does abundance mean, and understand what the economist is saying. And basically what most economists, even those that aren't Christian, most of them, I think, see themselves, while they're trying to be independent analysts of the world, they want abundance for the world. They want abundance for everybody. And I think many of them would see themselves involved in studying economics because that is their desire for the world, that they want everybody to live abundantly. And so I think if you come with the notion that the conversation partner you're about to engage with as a theologian talking to an economist, shares your general vision for what the world is, rather than somebody who is an antagonist who's all about self-centered, about greed and destroying the world. I think you end up with a more productive conversation. And that doesn't mean economists don't have things to learn from theologians. Obviously they do, but I think that's where the conversation.
Yeah, well, you're just making a case for what we need to do that we don't do very well currently, not only in the church, but in the culture, is have a good conversation.
Yeah, exactly.
And actually listen to each other.
Yeah.
And that can be very difficult. So, wow. Well, this has been a great discussion, and I just appreciate again, as always, your wisdom and your insight on this. Well, I guess that's it for today. Unless there's anything else that you have for the good of the order.
I think that's good.
Other than go Chiefs, right?
You bet. Got 3 more wins to go here.
Yeah. I'm not, who are they playing? Who's next?
So Cincinnati's next, and I suspect if they get through Cincinnati, it's probably going to be Tennessee.
Cincinnati's looking good. Cincinnati
beat them 2 or 3 weeks ago. In fact, Cincinnati, Tennessee. Who else is left? I forget who the other team is that's in there. But anyway, they've lost all 3. Buffalo. They played all 3 of those teams this year, and they lost all 3 of them.
All right. So
there's a little bit of nervousness here in the Kansas City. So.
At least you get to cheer for your team as usual. I get to root against somebody.
Well,
anyway, but we'll see how that goes anyway.
Yeah.
All right, friends. Well, thank you to Michael Kruse. And this is, again, Faith Seeking Understanding. And I'm Allan Bevere. And a reminder that here at Faith Seeking Understanding, our patron saint is Anselm of Canterbury, who says, I do not understand in order to have faith, but I have faith in order to understand. All right, everybody, have a great day. And everyone, take care.
Bye now.
Bye-bye. All right.
Okay.
I think we're done. No, we're not.
Alrighty.
Recording.
Yep.
I love all this. End of meeting for all. I hate that.